internets. Throughout the years, many terms have been coined in order to describe the people in a society that hold the lion's share of political and cultural power and influence. Words like the establishment or elite globalists. Both these terms have some minor technical differences between each other, but most of the time they are both used to describe roughly the same people and roughly the same institutions. They are effectively the global status quo of the post-World War II era we live in, a global culture of mixed markets and democracy present on just about every continent and the people who control them. The establishment usually refers to the broad group of people who are in charge of a nation, while the term globalists usually refers to those who extend and exert that power onto the international stage. Many of them are, of course, often the same people. However, one slightly less common, but far more interesting phrase to describe this is the cathedral. And this term comes with significantly more implications behind it than the other two. The cathedral is a deep topic, and Curtis Yarvin, also known as Moldbug, the man who coined this term, unfortunately has a tendency to overcomplicate the subject when talking about it. So in this video, I shall be explaining the subject of the cathedral at length, what it means for our modern times, the misconceptions people often have about it, the problems that result from the cathedral, some unique ideas that I believe Moldbug himself gets wrong about it, and finally what can actually be done about it. So first I'll explain just what the cathedral is. In a nutshell, the cathedral is specifically referring to the media and academic institutions within the establishment. Or as Moldbug puts it, the cathedral is a short way to say journalism plus academia, and how the intellectual institutions in our society don't always have the best interest in truth and freedom, but rather work together to push a certain narrative. It can also be conflated with the red pill concept, that what is presented as fact by the corporate press is a carefully constructed narrative intentionally designed to keep some very unpleasant people in power. Another way to look at it is as a source of the Overton window, which is a term that describes the range of acceptable politically correct things to say. It represents the general public perception of what I like to call correct opinions trademark. Journalists and academia have a special role in this, in that they are in a position that lets them shape the public perception and thus keep the Overton window in a location that benefits them. The reason it is called the cathedral is because of how closely the power dynamics of the current location of this window have grown over the last 50 years to resemble this strange, fundamentalist religion almost. Or again, as Moldbug puts it, intellectual institutions at the center of modern society, just as the church was the intellectual institution at the center of medieval society. For instance, you may have heard the term the cult of woke, and I've used that term on my channel before, and refers to how this cult has an outgroup which it deems as bigots and an in-group themselves, which they consider people who stand for justice and truth, and most importantly, equality, and all that. This is all very similar to how a fundamentalist cult might deem outsiders as heretics, and insiders as the enlightened faithful. Another similarity is dogma. The woke mindset represents an aggressive push for diversity, equity, inclusion under the false pretense that a lack of these things indicates an unfair or discriminatory component that must be ironed out of society. There was a fairly good point made recently by Mises that their theory of knowledge is largely based on subjective experiences rather than honest examination of data or logical arguments, Frankfurt School theory and all that. When something is valued more than truth, this creates a problem because it cannot be challenged or questioned through the use of truth. We can see this cathedral in action with things like cancel culture, the World Economic Forum's website being filled to the brim with virtue signaling, establishment politicians always saying things within a certain narrow threshold of acceptable public opinion, journalists colluding on propaganda narratives and attacking anything that has been deemed unacceptable, and so on and so forth. What's interesting is that what is considered acceptable and unacceptable by this dogma can change over time, but the institutions of mainstream media and academia all seem to move at the same pace, in the same direction, as if they were all reading from the same doctrine at the same speed. It's as if they were all working together. But that's where we run into our first big misconception about just what the cathedral is. And that is the accusation that the cathedral is just another spin-off the old shadow government conspiracy theory. This is the most common straw man you will get when trying to explain the concept of the cathedral to your average normie. And it couldn't be further from the truth. The cathedral is in fact, if anything, an anti-conspiracy theory. It seeks to explain how this cohesive narrative of wokeism can actually arise from a completely decentralized force. No one single group or individual is in charge of the cathedral. There are some who have more influence than others, but no one is 100% in control of this beast, or anywhere close to it. In other words, this theory is a logical explanation to show how what seems to be a global conspiracy is in fact something very different. Or as Moldbug puts it, The mystery of the Cathedral is that all the modern world's legitimate and prestigious intellectual institutions, even though they have no central organizational connection, behave in many ways as if they are a single organizational structure. And this is where things start to get a little complex, because it proceeds to the question, how in the heck is the Cathedral able to operate as such a seemingly cohesive unit that moves in one direction for controlling narratives if there is no central authority? There are a lot of methods, but the two biggest come down to ideological intolerance and incentives. The first is easy to understand. Intolerant ideologies placed next to tolerant ideologies will have a higher fitness score, because if at any given moment in time the intolerant ideology gains enough percentage of support, it will then use that majority support to push out the more tolerant ideology. It is a very similar force as the one behind why a fundamentalist religion tends to grow in popularity faster to a religion that is more liberal and more open. This perfectly explains why the cult of woke has done so well. Wokeism is a very unique ideology in that it is both ideologically intolerant and also a secular belief system that doesn't actually have a god attached to it, but still acts as if it's a religion, in that it has no supernatural claim to the metaphysical, nor is anything like that included in their epistemology, beyond an obsession with harm avoidance and equality placed above truth. A perfect example is, once again, the equity fallacy. A common woke schooled argument in a secular institution will be to identify an inequity, assert the cause must be a negative, and then falsely accuse anyone who dissents of being a bigot. This shifts the argument away from rational thought and into the realm of an unfalsifiable Kafkaesque accusation, which then allows the wokists to shame their opposition into silence. And as more and more wokists gain control of institutions, you now have an environment where being a wokist, or at least claiming to have woke beliefs, is now highly selected for. And now that we have an environment set up, we can now understand where the incentives lie, such as incentives to maintain a power structure that benefits them for those who already have prestige in the Cathedral, or an incentive to fit in or to gain prestige within the Cathedral for those who have not gained such prestige. In other words, people who have gained elite status within a society's intellectual class have an incentive to ensure that they keep that elite status by maintaining the status quo. Those who are wannabes also have similar incentive. People who desire to gain elite status within intellectual institutions have an incentive to virtue signal their allegiance to the ideas currently accepted within the Cathedral's Overton window. The result of this is that millions of people will end up converging on a short list of accepted ideas, despite them taking pathways that are seemingly unconnected and branch from hundreds of thousands of different possibilities and directions, each branching into hundreds of thousands of more possibilities and so on. And yet, in the end, everyone becomes a crab. This is an interesting phenomenon in nature known as convergent evolution, where two species that are completely unrelated to each other take on a similar shape and form due to being in a similar environment, which selects a high fitness score for that form. The crab example is sometimes given for this because the crab form has manifested itself multiple times in this way. How this jargon relates to the Cathedral can sometimes appear a little bit esoteric and off there, so I will simplify it by an example. Say you have this guy, Carl, who has achieved his lifelong dream of being hired on as a journalist for a major publication. But Carl has a problem. He really isn't that clever. So how does Carl keep his prestigious position? Well, one day Carl then sees a developing story. Gamers are misogynies. Oh no, fair maiden's in trouble. And so what does Carl do? Well, he trips over himself to one-up other journos to virtue signal about it, without bothering to check the facts of the story, and concocts a completely nonsensical article that basically just parrots what everybody else is saying in the most woke way he can think of. And now here's the issue, the rub of the problem. There are lots of Carls, each with the same incentive as him, and before you know it, you have hundreds of woke opinion editorials that have zero basis in truth. Simultaneously, on the other side in academia, we have this young woman named Martha. Martha is a fresh sociologist and would like to make a name for herself and publish some academic papers in her name and pass them through peer review. But Martha has a problem. She really isn't that clever. So what does Martha do? Well, she follows the incentives to play it safe. Find some polynormative five-spirit intersectional inequities to word soup about, don't control for anything meaningful, and presto, her work is praised and paraded around, and hey, it might even appear in Carl's editorials. Again, same troublesome issue. There are lots of Marthas all just following the same incentives. The basic issue here is that the system rewards the Carls and Marthas. So before you know it, you have a mountain of pseudo-intellectual nonsense written by hundreds of Carls and Marthas, which is then highly praised by other Carls and Marthas, creating a pathway where it is now a massive echo chamber. And so the optimal strategy for these people, or for any other midwit who gets into our intellectual institutions, is to become a Carl or a Martha themselves, as it is highly rewarding despite not actually requiring any real talent. Anyone who pushes back against the increasing tide of insanity is falsely labeled a bigot, deplatformed and disbarred, and before you know it, everyone in this institution starts to look like a Carl or a Martha, purely through the forces of natural selection. No shadow government necessary. A perfect recent real-life example of this is Musk's Twitter deal. It reduced the power of mainstream journalists, which angered a lot of very powerful people. This led to every talentless hack journo and mid-witted so-called expert to trip over each other in a rush to push out whatever dumb hit pieces they could make, while intentionally ignoring the data and usage stats showing that Twitter is actually doing just fine. These people aren't actually being commanded by some secret demonic Illuminati behind the scenes to write these nonsensical papers. They're just being driven by a desire to one-up each other in a competition for who can look like the shiniest, biggest, and bestest crab. To summarize, the main problem with the Cathedral and why it should be seen as a threat to our freedoms is that it incentivizes people to become these woke crabs who view all inequities as a problem. It's a classic case of when you are a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This is very bad because the logical conclusion of being obsessed with equal outcomes is one that basically just justifies Marxist rhetoric. And so we now have a system that eventually turns people into Marxist crabs. Hence why breadtube socialists are perfectly happy with operating within the hallways of the Cathedral. Speaking of breadtube, the other retort you might get from people who buy into the dogma of the Cathedral is the real reason journalists and academics tend to converge on the conclusion of wokeness is because woke ideology is just true, man. And anything that says otherwise is literally hit war. Just look at this tweet from Voosh as a recent example of this kind of bad faith. Now, this is a lot easier to refute because it's just a case of them intentionally misunderstanding what people who do not buy into their dogma mean when we say the word woke. No, wokery is not synonymous with truth, nor is it liberal progressivism. It rather means placing the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion above truth, as it requires viewing disparate outcomes as bad despite overwhelming evidence that this is not always the case, resulting in a slow march towards nonsense. It doesn't necessarily need to have anything to do with ethnic groups and can easily apply at the individual level. And another thing is that progress can either come from the left or the right. So this idea from Bush that being against liberal progressivism must mean being pro-World War II Germany is little more than just another false dichotomy fallacy from him. Another misconception people have on how the Cathedral operates is missing the importance of how oligarchy factors into it. Moldbug explains this as, an oligarchy inherently converges on ideas that justify the use of power. Rule by rich, special interests is one of the engines that allows the Cathedral to maintain its control. Another way to look at it is an economic system of capitalized gains, but socialized losses, sometimes called corporatism, where the everyday taxpayer is forced to fit the bill for the decisions of these incompetent rent-seeking elites. This can explain how the Cathedral receives its economic funding as long as an oligarchy is maintained. They will always be able to forcibly extract wealth and move it to areas that benefit themselves, and maintain the Cathedral. A perfect example of this is the ideas put forth by the World Economic Forum, which openly advocates for this type of corrupt market behavior by sugarcoating it as public and private cooperation. Or in their own words, the World Economic Forum is the International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation. Simply reading their mission statement with a critical eye for propaganda reveals the grift for what it is, and how it ties to the Cathedral for what it is. So let's go over this real quick. The forum engages the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. It was established in 1971 as a not-for-profit foundation and is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It is independent, impartial, and not tied to any special interests. The forum strives in all its efforts to demonstrate entrepreneurship in the global public interest while upholding the highest standards of governance. Moral and intellectual integrity is at the heart of everything it does. Our activities are shaped by a unique institutional culture founded on the stakeholder theory, which asserts that an organization is accountable to all parts of society. The institution carefully blends and balances the best of many kinds of organizations, from both the public and private sectors, international organizations, and academic institutions. We believe that progress happens by bringing together people from all walks of life who have the drive and the influence to make positive change. And if you disagree, you're a bigot. Of course, that last part isn't in there, but it might as well be in there. What they are saying here is full of contradictions. How can they not be tied to any special interests if their mission is for special interests guiding government spending and controlling the government? How can they blend and balance many organizations and not be tied to any special interests as a result of from those organizations' special interests? How can they be for political global control and not be for special interests? This is absolutely ridiculous. Schwab even brags about how many members of the World Economic Forum currently hold political power in various talks. Anyone can call themselves the good guy and say they uphold the highest standards of moral and intellectual integrity and inclusiveness and all that. Anyone can claim to be making positive change, but what matters is, are their ideas actually good for making positive change? Does global political control really give people any meaningful change? Or is it just maintaining the status quo? The answer is they're really just trying to maintain the status quo. But when an obvious lie like this can be spotted in their own mission statement, it's pretty clear what's going on here. Although it's important to remember that the World Economic Forum is, again, not a shadow government. They are just one of many organizations that operate in a manner that is used to justify the Cathedral in order to fund its expenses, oftentimes on the dime of the taxpayer. So next I would like to talk about some things I believe Moldbug got wrong. And the first of these things is the idea that there is some mysterious force driving a march towards leftist progressivism that is inevitable, which he describes as Cthulhu slowly swimming left. The problem with this is that it seems like he is assuming that because the environment our current institutional systems has created is selecting for woke crabs, that it always has to be this way, that is just the ideal crab. This falsely assumes that all right-leaning values can only conserve a system, and that only leftist values can subvert a system and encourage crab mentality. A simple logical question that proves this might not necessarily be a great idea is to ask yourself, is a leftist that wants to conserve the existence of the Federal Reserve really being progressive, and is a rightoid who wishes to abolish it and adopt a decentralized and high-tech alternative truly preserving the system or subverting it? Or an even more obvious example, is a liberal arts major pushing against AI art being progressive or being conservative? The reality is that history is cyclical, and meaningful change can come from anyone or any side. Treating the cult of woke as some mysterious, unknowable, unstoppable force gives it far more credit than it deserves. It also makes me suspect Moldbug is missing a crucial element of his own theory, which is that technically there will always be some kind of cathedral. Incentives to try and fit in with the elites by stating fashionable, correct opinions will always be a thing. You can't actually get rid of the cathedral because how it operates is something that is integral to human nature. The question is, what ideology is at the center of those opinions, and what is at the center of the cathedral? Is it one that is intolerant and falsely demonizes those outside of it, or is it one that is more open-minded and based on logic-based values instead of subjective values, instead opting to remove only those who believe in violence as the answer? The Overton window is not an inherently evil thing. If everything outside of that window truly did represent idiocy and violence, and everything within acceptable discourse really did represent the broader range of honest discourse and freedom, then the incentive to preserve it would be a force for good. This idea that the left has some kind of monopoly on progressive change is just false. And on this note of disagreeing with how Moldbug views the left and right, another extremely important thing to point out here is that you do not necessarily need to adopt a specific political ideology, such as Moldbug's neo-reactionary form of absolute monarchism, to grasp what the cathedral is and why it is a problem. You can be a conservative, a centrist, a libertarian, or even left-wing, and be aware of the problems of the cathedral and how it operates. This is actually a woke school talking point that many people fall for. This cancerous idea that you must be a Whignot or white nationalist in order to stand against them. You do not need to be either of those things in order to call out an obvious contradiction in how society operates. You can be very much against both of those two positions while still standing up for any values that you may have and calling out any anti-white racism that is often pervasive in the more far-left strains of wokeism. When people make the mistake of actually becoming an unironic authoritarian racial supremacist in favor of things like state-enforced collective discrimination in response to the cathedral, they are only falling for the cult of woke scheme of painting a false dichotomy between themselves and the supremacists. Oh, own te libs by becoming the monster the libs falsely accuse you of being. Top mind moment right there. Oh boy, there are other ways that are both far more logical and more ethical. Read Hoppe. The last thing I believe Moldbug gets wrong is that his general theory of the cathedral underrates the state element, or the alliance of throne and altar. He kind of goes into this by pointing out that a driving factor is oligarchy, but missed the broader problem. One of the reasons why the church in medieval times was able to retain their power was they had a two-way relationship with the ruling party. The church would use their influence to legitimize the monarch's rule, while the monarch would then use their power to keep the church's monopoly on the original gangster cathedral. What we see here is two monopolies justifying and aiding each other in order to maintain a parasitic relationship. What is it to say that it will not be like that again? This is where Moldbug makes a critical mistake. His solution to what he views as decentralized power by the oligarchy seems to be to monopolize that power in a state that does not allegedly leak power, i.e. the absolute monarchy. The state of oligarchy has a fairly large influence on the cathedral, true, due to their ability to essentially pump near infinite amounts of value into a system regardless of whether or not anyone actually wants it. For instance, the state can give grant money to fund endless amounts of bogus research we see from academia, or the state can uphold draconian intellectual property laws. One need only look look at the financial relationship between the state and the media to see the state-media proxy connection. Then there is the obvious connection with disparate impact laws and how they create a legal justification for the push for more equity, and the secular religion of wokeness that logically spawns from it. Moldbug seems to partially recognize this in his writings. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion until that religion manages to sneak God under the carpet, at which point go ahead, dudes. But he failed to make the connection that this law has already been in place for a solid 50 years. If we wish to fix these problems, we can't just ignore the state and their tendency to extract wealth from people and then funnel that wealth elsewhere. An absolute monarchy will not actually fix that problem, and an absolute monarch may be slightly less incentivized to do this than an oligarchy would, but that doesn't make it a foolproof or the best plan. An absolute monarch absolutely can leak power and choose to fund the cathedral, as evidenced by the fact that it already happened in history. So anyways, now to wrap this all up, what can actually be done about the cathedral? Well, the first idea comes from Moldbug himself. We must first recognize that many modern Western societies have in fact become progressive atheocracies. That is, a system of government based on theocracy, with the only difference is that this religion doesn't claim belief in a god. The answer to how to deal with this can thus be found imagining yourself in a position of someone who wishes to overthrow a theocracy. What first must be done is to create alternative intellectual institutions that can challenge the doctrine of that theocracy. This solution involves focus on a parallel economy that has a freedom of expression as a principle, which allows people to challenge the dogma of forcing equity without being attacked by the Kafka-trapping mob of woke crabs. Right now, the big reason why the cathedral has grown to such a monolithic scale is because they have hit critical mass, the point where they have enough influence that they can control narratives within mainstream institutions. So one possible answer is to create alternative institutions, such as supporting the use of alt-tech and alternative media, where those institutions can arise from. Another possibility that is a little bit harder to do is recapturing media institutions from the cathedral, which actually kind of is in the works with Twitter, and to some moderate amount of success, I suppose. It's also serving as a fantastic red pill opportunity because people get to watch the cathedral throw an absolute cow fit over what Musk is doing, which exposes a key weakness in the cathedral. A huge number of people who are members of it have no idea that they are members, which means that when the cathedral moves in a direction that is an existential mistake to itself, many of its members will be incentivized to make complete fools of themselves on stage for all to see. In other words, a huge portion of the people who are members of this cult do not actually know that they are members of this cult. This is a very glaring weakness that can absolutely be used against them. Because for one, it's very easy to bait these people into saying things that are demonstrably stupid and very easy to refute, but again, because people can't actually hold much loyalty to a system they aren't really aware of. It's a lot easier to deprogram people from this cult than you might think because of that. In fact, it's really only the most fervent members of this cult that will give any real pushback when faced with evidence that shows the many contradictions and lies within our media. There are many centrists out there who are aware that something is wrong, and again, they don't actually have any loyalty to this system. The more people who are no longer seeking prestige within the cathedral, the less power the cathedral has. The big one I wish more people would stress is the fact that the scientific method is in fact a good method. The problem is that soft sciences, like psychology and sociology that have been captured by the cathedral, do not actually follow this method anymore, at least not in good faith. And so because the cathedral operates in our intellectual institutions, the best way to push back against them could very well be just refuting the nonsense and propaganda they spew on an intellectual level. In many ways, my own channel is basically dedicated to doing just that, going over the lies and propaganda being spewed by cathedralites in the greater establishment and directly showing why they are wrong. There are many other channels that are also doing this. Sharing any good videos that you can find which directly refute the nonsense of Clown World can go a very long way. Anyways, that's all for now. If you like what you just watched, feel free to subscribe, share, and all that algorithm stuff. Till next time.